Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the show. This evening, my guest will be Mr. Bill Faison. He's the representative for North Carolina, House District 50. How you doing there, Mr. Faison?
I'm doing great, Paul. How are you doing?
Great. Thank you for coming on the show.
Oh, thank you for letting me come join you. You got to call me Bill. Anytime anybody puts a label in front of my name,
yes,
I lose another handful of hair. And as we can both see, I can't afford the loss.
That's great. Thank you, Bill, for coming on the show. Recently, you were running for governor. What was your reason for wanting to run for governor, and what made you want to do it?
Well, as you know, I'm a single father.
Correct.
And I have 6 children. And the oldest of my younger group
Correct.
Is in college. In fact, I have 3 in college right now. Now, you could say that wasn't good planning on my part.
Oh, yes.
But the oldest of the 3 who's in college had been talking with me about government and about his view of it and about how folks his age view it. And what he was telling me is that his view was it wasn't working. Mm-hmm. And so I started trying to look at things from his perspective. And part of what I saw is what he was facing when he was going to get out of school. Do you realize that roughly half of our young people coming out of college today cannot find a job in their chosen field? Right. Not only not in their chosen field, but they can't find a job that requires a college education. Mm-hmm. And yet half of our young people come out of college today with student loans between $26,000 and $28,000.
Correct.
Well, how are you going to pay back a college loan with a job that pays a salary that doesn't require a college education to do the job? I mean, it just doesn't work. And in talking with him and his sense that things weren't working, I began to look at the world another way. And as I did, what I saw was that folks on the Republican side of the aisle, they'd just taken over. Well, they weren't doing anything to help the situation. Worse, they were passing a budget that was going to fire over 36,000 people. And then I looked at the folks on my side of the aisle. I'm a Democrat.
Correct.
I'm proud to be a Democrat. But the folks on my side of the aisle didn't have a jobs plan either. So then I looked to our governor. Well, our governor didn't have a jobs plan. In fact, made a conscious decision not to have one. I've got the email. Correct. And my thought was, this is not acceptable. So I got in it not to run for governor. I got in it because of the issue. Because in our state, unemployment rates have been running about 10%, thereabouts, a little below, a little above, unless you're African American. And then the unemployment rate is running above 20%.
It's a high rate.
But that's the unemployment rate coming out of the Employment Security Commission. Well, when they do the math, they don't include in their numbers folks who've either taken part-time work or who've given up looking. So instead of there being somewhere between 450,000 and 500,000 people out of work,
yes, sir,
the real number's probably closer to 700,000. And instead of the unemployment rate in the African American community running at about 20%, it's probably running closer to 25 to 30%. Well, it's not just that those are terrible numbers, but it means that they're terrible life stories. For example, I was at the convenience store a few weeks back. I was getting gas. I was talking to the woman behind the counter.
Yes, sir.
And she told me that before the recession, the great recession we've just all been through, she was making $42,000 a year. Proud of her job. Lost it through no fault of her own, function of the economy. And then she started looking for something to do. Well, she took part-time work. And you know what that means. Not only is she not making enough money to live on, but it also means she's not in the Employment Security Commission numbers.
Okay.
So it looks better for the Employment Security Commission that she's got a part-time job, but it doesn't look too good at the end of the month at home when she's stroking the check for the light bill, and so much less the food bill or the health care bill. And so she was working at the mini mart helping sell gas. And finally, she was real proud of herself. She had found a job, a full-time job, paying $26,000 a year. Well, you can't be making $42,000 a year and take a $16,000 a year cut without getting bad hurt. I mean, there are things that you were having health care and a car, or one kind of car versus another, or a house instead of an apartment. That stuff's going. And it was a tragedy, and it's a tragedy I saw repeated over and over and over again. So I didn't set out to run for governor. I set out to try to get folks at the legislative and the administrative level to focus on the problem. And the problem is that people need a job and need work to be able to feed their family, keep their house, and keep a ride under them. And so that's where I started. And when I did that, what I found is that my Republican friends were over at the legislature, and instead of addressing the issues that are crushing people, which are jobs, the economy, health care, and how to pay for education, what they were focused on was their social agenda. And let me give you some examples of that. For example, one of the things that had gone through the legislature just a couple of years before was the Racial Justice Act. And what it says is that if somebody is facing a death sentence and they can show that race was a factor in imposing the death sentence, then the sentence is changed to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Who could argue with that? Who in the world should ever be put to death because of the shade of the color of their skin?
That's true.
I mean, give me a break. And so Representatives Larry Womble and Earlene Parman from up in Winston-Salem and Senator Floyd McKissick from up in Durham brought this bill before the legislature. Well, when it got to the House where I serve, I chaired at that time the Ways and Means Committee, and it was going through, or hoped to go through, my committee. Well, they brought it to the committee, and when they presented the legislation, wonderful legislation, made good sense, good people sense, good common sense, every Democrat on the committee voted for it. What do you think every Republican did?
Vote against it. Yeah.
You're exactly right. So we got it to the floor of the House. Same thing. Every Democrat voted for it. What do you think Republicans did?
Vote against.
So they get in control. So what's one of the first things they do? Well, they go in and gut the Racial Justice Act. Now, fortunately, the governor vetoed that. And I stand with the governor on the veto. And a Friday, about 3 Fridays ago, I think it is now, either 3 or 4 Fridays ago, Judge Greg Weeks over in Fayetteville issued the first order under the Racial Justice Act, finding that the death penalty had been imposed on a man because of the color of his skin, and changed his sentence to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Now, we all know there have been mistakes made in the justice system. We know there have been people who've been on death row, some for as long as 15 years, facing death at any time, only to find out through modern techniques and science and DNA testing that they did not do the crime. They're doing the time, but about to have their time in this world cut off for something they didn't do. And so we know those kinds of mistakes are out there. We know that kind of change needs to take place. We know we need better systems and better tests. And the idea that somebody could be put to death, not because of what they did, not because it's being administered fairly, if you can ever administer the death penalty fairly, but because of the color of their skin, it's awful. And the Republicans have come right back in, and as part of their social agenda, that's what they're doing. But they didn't stop there. Why, they decided they were going to try to suppress the African American vote with voter ID. You know, in North Carolina, the African American population is 20.5% of the population. But in the Democratic vote, it's over 38% of the vote. Well, what they decided to do is they would try to suppress the African American vote through their voter ID legislation and the older Americans' votes. And so they passed this voter ID legislation. Now, fortunately, the governor vetoed that, and I stand with the governor on that veto as well. I voted against their efforts to get that done. But they didn't stop there. They decided they wanted to have concealed carry, not just in your car or out somewhere in public, but they wanted to have concealed carry in restaurant bars. Now, you don't have to be a genius to figure out that guns and bars don't work well
Correct.
together.
That's true.
You know, go back to Tombstone. It's a good way to get shot up. Well, they wanted to get guns in bars, but they didn't want to stop there. They wanted to be able to carry them onto school campuses, and not just there, but they wanted to be able to take guns to parades. I mean, it wasn't, in your memory and mine, we had the parade up in Greensboro with the Ku Klux Klan firing off guns, and I don't know that we ever got enough of those folks in jail, but they're trying to make it legal to carry the gun to the parade. I mean, come on.
That's true.
While they're focusing on those issues, which don't help people. Oh, and they went after immigrants as well. You know, one of the things that folks who've immigrated to this country, and by the way, I'm 1/8 American Indian,
Okay.
and everybody looks like an immigrant to me. So
Yes.
you understand the
Correct.
perspective. So if people are coming to this country and people are here working and are part of the system, then you need to be able to identify yourself for all kinds of reasons. And if you're here because you've got a job and somebody needs the job done, then you need to be able to legally get from your house to the job.
Correct.
Which means a driver's license. Well, what this Republican crowd set about trying to do was make it so folks couldn't identify themselves. There's a card issued by the Mexican consulate, and by the way, the Mexican consulate has an office in Raleigh.
Okay.
And so there's a card issued by the Mexican consulate. It's called the Matricular Consular card, and it's an identification card. And so the Republicans, not because the chief of police were coming in and saying, we have a problem with this card. Nobody came in and said, this is a problem. The Republicans stepped up and said, well, we're going to take away the ability of a municipality, which means any police force, to accept this card as a form of identification. And they said, well, why? The police aren't here complaining about it. Why do you want to do that? And they said, well, we just are. We can and we are. I said, well, that's not right. And they said, oh, well, don't worry about it. One reason we'll give you is you can get a fake one. And so somebody got real smart on the legislature, because we have computers in there. So they did a search, and what they searched for were fake matricular consular cards, and then they searched for fake North Carolina driver's license. And they found that they had about 3,000 websites where you could get a fake matricular consular card.
Okay.
But over 13,000 websites where you get a fake North Carolina driver's license. So that's really no reason.
Correct.
And so instead of focusing on how do we get people back to work, how do we educate our kids, how do we deal with health care, how do we treat everybody within our society fairly, make sure everybody has an equal opportunity to move forward, what this crowd has been focusing on is a social agenda intended to identify minority groups and disadvantage them in one way or another. For example, in their budget, they fired over 36,000 people. Now, the way they did that is this. They cut out teaching positions and teaching assistant positions and said that they weren't going to affect any teachers. Well, they were wrong.
Correct.
Over 6,000 people lost their jobs. Teachers and teachers' assistants were among them. But what was worse is they cut out the funding, a bunch of the funding, about $340 million of funding for Medicaid and S-CHIP. Well, these are programs that the feds match $2 and $3 for every one you'll put in. So instead of cutting out $340 million, they really cut out over $1 billion going into those programs folks in the community desperately need, and threw away over $600 million in federal money. Now, that federal money is going somewhere. It can either go to North Carolina and help our economy, or it can go to Virginia, South Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi, somewhere. But what that crowd did is tell Washington, you take your $660 million and do something